Greetings, my scattered brothers and sisters in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that his presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. Well, we are rejoining Jesus, Mark chapter 7, and you'll remember that Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law from Jerusalem came to check up on Jesus. They had heard about him, they came to see what he was doing, and they noticed that his disciples were eating without first ceremonially washing their hands. And they questioned Jesus about this. And it's really not simply a question about the disciples, but a question about Jesus. Why are you letting your disciples do this? Ceremonially, they were to wash their hands before they ate, not for hygiene reasons, but in order to kind of cleanse themselves of worldliness. And so Jesus is taken aback by this whole thing and sees the hypocrisy in it, that they're concerned about worldliness when they're really not living right themselves. And so we'll pick it up where Jesus is quoting Isaiah, and then Jesus is going to go into an example of how they are putting the traditions of men above the word of God, the commands of God. So Jesus says this, and Jesus said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men.' You leave the commandment of God and hold to the traditions of men." And that's the big charge, that they are turning away from God's commands, which are pretty clear and obvious, and they're holding on to traditions that their own teachers had created. And Jesus said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die.' But you say, 'If a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is, given to God,' then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do." So this tradition of Corban was that you would dedicate something to God, and once it was dedicated to God, then you had the ability to say, "No, can't use it to help you. It's dedicated to God." The law was clear. Moses' commands were clear that we're to care for our parents, and that doesn't just mean obeying them when we're children, but also caring for them when they're older and they need care, they need attention, need our resources. And yet what would happen during Jesus' day is that people found a way to circumvent this by saying that their resources were dedicated to God. Now, this might be something that was given as a gift to the temple. And so the leaders of the temple were saying, "No, you cannot take that back. You've already dedicated that to God. That's coming to the temple." And so maybe they were still in possession of it, but they weren't going to be able to use it to care for their parents, even though that's what the law had commanded. Rather, because of this dedicating it to God, dedicating it to the use of the temple, the priest and the rabbis, they weren't going to let them, take it back. They were going to make sure they got it. And so the human tradition of dedicating something to God was taking priority over God's actual word to take care of your parents. Maybe another way that this would play out is I might be in a bind, and I might swear to God, "God, if you just answer my prayer, I'm going to give you, fill in the blank." Whether it's a field when I sell it, or the proceeds of a field when I sell it, whether it's, livestock, anything. But God, if you hear my prayer, I will give this to you. God answers the prayer, and you may or may not ever follow through on giving it to God, but you're certainly not going to use it to help your parents because you took an oath that you were going to give it to God. And so you can't use it for your parents. Again, it just becomes a way around, caring for those that you're responsible for, because you're basically greedy or concerned about, keeping an oath that you should have never made in the first place, so that you're actually neglecting what God would have you to do. So that's kind of the background of it. And that's where Jesus is saying that, you're being hypocritical. You're putting human traditions ahead of what God actually has commanded, what God actually wants. And so that makes me kind of pause and think, okay, at what point do we do this today? To where we're pretty hypocritical, we're putting human traditions above what God actually wants. And maybe even using, God as the excuse for doing it. We've dedicated this to God. So you might be able to think in terms of gifts that have strings attached. And so a gift is given, there's strings attached to it in terms of how that gift can be used. And maybe what those strings are actually doing is kind of binding that gift from being used in such a way that would actually be pleasing to God, because there are strings attached. So I don't know, this one is pretty particular, but I would challenge you to think about it in terms of what are some things that maybe we've dedicated to God. And in dedicating to God, it simply becomes a way of not having to use those things in a manner that God would actually have us use them. Just a quick example, if I dedicated my truck to God, and then that means if somebody wants to borrow my truck, use my truck, and I don't really want them to, I just have a built-in excuse. Well, I've dedicated it to God. I don't think you're using it for a godly purpose. And so, no, I'm not going to allow you to use my truck. I'm not going to help you. So there, I've dedicated something to God, but I'm using that as an excuse to really not help my neighbor out in need, not love my neighbor, not when my neighbor asks for something to be able to say no, when really I should be saying yes. And so maybe you can think of some examples, maybe better examples than that, but that's the challenge, is to actually keep the commands of God rather than allow our traditions to get in the way of actual obedience. Well, God bless. Hope you have a great day. And wherever you find yourself scattered, keep the word and forego the traditions, or don't let the traditions get in the way of obedience to the word. God bless.